Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the good people at Polyhymnia.
Thank you. I was afraid you were going to ask me to say it.
Polyhymnia. You can do it. Go ahead, try.
Well, I can now. Don't ask me next week.
You're on the board of directors. You should probably be able to pronounce the name of the...
Khaki was easy.
Do you even know what khaki stood for? No, let's not
The
get there.
Center for American Culture and Ideas.
Well, how about you? You were paying attention at all those meetings.
Right.
Both of them. Anyway, what's new and exciting? Well, we should stop for just a second, because what's new and exciting in all of our lives is that today, literally hours ago as we record this, a new pope has been selected.
Yeah, and an American. I was claiming there's no way an American would be elected.
Ant, I didn't think I would see an American pope in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And yet here we are. Now, I have nothing reasonable to say about him. So unlike every other podcast host, I'm not going to say anything. Right. I mean, this is maybe the approach we should all take. But the next few weeks are going to be interesting as he figures out how to sit in that big chair and what he wants his papacy to look like.
Yeah.
And I was no fan of the last one. So here's to hoping this one is better. Come on, man. Let me do. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, you already said that.
I have to say it.
A few episodes ago, I believe, we talked about the dire wolf that has been de-extincted. Yeah. Building on that, there are a couple of companies, the Organoid Company and Lab Grown Leather, have gotten together, and they are working to create, quote, the first cruelty-free biodegradable handbag made from T-Rex skin. They've gotten hold of some DNA and they're trying to grow this lab-grown T-Rex skin and make leather handbags out of it. I'm just left here scratching my head. I've known, well, we've all known for decades, that scientific technology has been growing exponentially. And I guess up until this point, what that has meant, at least what it meant to me, is that, we're going to get more and more stuff and faster. But now I'm noticing something interesting, that the technology is growing at such a remarkable pace that occupying the same planet are things out of science fiction stories that would have before been set 1,000 years into the future. And within the same country, I'm talking about America now, people who believe that the world is 6,000 years old. To have people living and interacting on those different planes, and I'm not picking on anybody in particular, I'm just saying that as technology grows at this exponential rate, we're going to get this weird kind of, I hate to use the word inequality, but I guess that's what I mean, this weird kind of space where some of us are thousands of years into the future compared to others of us.
It is interesting, right? The wolf thing is fascinating, and I try to keep current on that sort of thing, as you know. But I love dogs, and I wouldn't half mind a wolf-dog combination, and everybody's going to send me hate mail telling me not to do it, that they're wild animals. I get it. But I can dream, can't I? And what I really want, Ant, and I've said it in my private life many times, I don't know that I've ever said it on Words and Numbers, I want woolly mammoths to come back. I want the genetic engineers to get on this and reintroduce woolly mammoths. And then I want them to give me a miniature woolly mammoth that I can keep in my house as a pet. But roughly the size of a German Shepherd, if you're out there thinking, how big should this be? So right. If you're a scientist listening, get on it, man. That's $1 million idea. You're going to sell woolly mammoths coming and going.
Well, if they can do that, I imagine they could make little pocket ones, like those pocket, whatever those little squirrels were that were popular with college students some years back.
Yeah, I don't want anything I can squish by mistake. I want something to be able to live through my rough treatment. And a pocket woolly mammoth, while excellent and cool and perfect for the desktop, is probably not what we're looking for. But anyway, I'm going to sadly get us off this topic and onto something else. Here's something I don't say very often. I read something great in the Wall Street Journal, and I don't say it very often because of their paywalls. I almost never read anything from the Wall Street Journal,
Right?
because who the hell can afford to pay them what they ask for? But this piece was left open for all to read in front of the paywall. And let me just read you the headline because you'll see right where it's going. The high school juniors with $70,000 a year job offers.
High school juniors.
High school juniors. These are 15 and 16-year-olds.
Being offered more than the median household income.
Being offered more than the median college graduate salary.
What are they doing?
Exactly what you would think. It is one step beyond an internship program in the trades. Now, employers are going to high schools saying, this is what we need.
Yep.
Can you teach them this?
Yep.
And the high schools, having sent people to college unnecessarily for decades, are saying, yes, we can do it. And in Philadelphia, it's taken root. And it's so good that there's some that are paying $68,000, $70,000 on day one, but there's another who pays $50,000. And he says within 5 years, you could be in six figures if you just take this job.
Wow.
That is more than almost every college graduate is ever going to make.
Yeah.
I remember the last class I taught, somebody was making snarky comments about income. And I said, how much do you fools think you're going to make first year out after college? And one after the next, they said $200,000.
Wow.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
That's never going to happen. Reality has this way about it of wising people up. And yet here we see people looking around and reacting to some clear incentives. And they're doing a great job. I'll leave the article in the show notes and people can check it out. It's well worth reading. It's a great story.
This makes me so happy, having spent years seeing students just wasting their money, their parents' money, their taxpayers' money, studying nonsense that isn't going to provide value to anybody.
And all of their time.
Their time, yeah, and the universities happily taking their money and pretending to be educating them.
Yep. Which brings us to the foolishness of the week. And this was...
That wasn't foolish.
No, that wasn't foolish at all. But this was one of the weeks where everywhere I looked, it was a target-rich environment this week. I almost went with Kash Patel, the FBI director in the Trump administration, who showed up for a budget meeting in front of the Senate without a proposed budget. That doesn't even get close to where we are with the actual foolishness of the week, because I want to draw your mind back to a time when Donald Trump, here we go again, right? It's always Donald Trump. His lips move and bad things happen. Do you remember when he released his meme coin and you could buy Donald Trump crypto?
Right, yes.
Did you buy any?
Oh, no.
Yeah, no, me neither. It turns out, and this is from our good friends at CNBC, a place that I actually rely on to get the story right way more often than not. This is a very good source for all things financial. And as a matter of fact, if you want to get the best news available on American TV, CNBC might be the correct answer. Even though it's financially driven, the news peeks through and it's almost always correct. 58 crypto wallets have made millions on the meme coin. 58. How many people do you think have lost money?
Oh, probably, I'm guessing hundreds of thousands.
764,000.
Okay, right.
764,000 rubes lined up to line the pockets of people who knew better.
And does it say anything about how much the 58 made?
Yeah, millions.
Millions, yeah.
Millions. So if you're looking for thievery, here it is. But the thievery that we get at this point very typically involves people lining up asking to be ripped off. I mean, how do you look at this and not know better? And yet, 764,000 people didn't.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. This week, Clark Neely joins us. Clark is Senior Vice President for Legal Studies at the Cato Institute and author of Terms of Engagement and a frequent guest on Words and Numbers. I've lost count, but this has got to be at least your 5th or 6th appearance.
5th or 6th? It must be 10th or 12th. Come on. And, one good Neely deserves another. We had your wife on just a couple of weeks ago, so it must be time to turn to you, especially in these difficult constitutional times that we've got ahead of us. I mean, I'm just going to throw you the biggest softball you've ever been thrown. What the hell is going on?
Well, nothing we've ever seen before. I think that where we are now is we have a president with an extraordinarily broad conception of the powers of that office. And frankly, I'm being a bit euphemistic here. A Congress that has abdicated essentially all of its constitutional responsibilities, and a judiciary that is doing its level best to sort of keep the whole, process going forward without going off the rails. And I'd say it's about an even money chance whether we pull through it.
It's interesting you say that because at least an episode ago, I said to James, just kind of off the cuff, that I haven't noticed Congress do anything since Newt Gingrich and the contract with America. And as soon as the words left my mouth, I realized, oh my God, that's true. This is like the 1990s and Congress hasn't done anything. Well, I mean, of course it passes laws, but you don't hear it taking any leadership role.
Yeah, and I think with the possible exception of the run-up to the Civil War, there's probably never been a more urgent time for Congress to bestir itself and actually do something, not just passing laws, but participate in democratic government, which it's just totally AOL. It is an open question how long we can sort of limp along with only 2 branches of government when one of them is controlled by, I'm just going to say it, a fundamentally authoritarian personality.
Yeah, I want to draw people's attention to what's going on with tariffs right now. My understanding from conversations with you is that tariffs are being a tax. They're within the purview of Congress, but Congress at some point just handed that off to the executive branch and said, do whatever you want.
Nope. That's how President Trump has interpreted it, but actually the delegation of tariff power from Congress was supposed to be fairly narrow and only apply to emergencies. And it's not just President Trump. Presidents before Trump have pushed the bounds of the term emergency so that everything from a mild disturbance to an actual emergency or a declared war gets lumped into that category. But no, the original grant of power to the president to impose tariffs was meant to be and was worded much more narrowly than it's been being conceived now.
Clark, we've been at this, and by this, I mean Congress deferring all of its authority to the executive branch. This is not a new thing. It's a process, and it's a process that's been ongoing at least since Woodrow Wilson, right? So this goes back a very long time, and there have been people like us who have been screaming from the rafters, don't do this. It will come to no good if you keep walking down this road. And here we are, right? The balance of power is utterly fouled at this point. I don't know that we're ever going to really get it back.
We've had many discussions about how the Constitution conceives of a federal government of enumerated, meaning specifically spelled out, and therefore limited powers. And under the FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, they essentially wanted to nationalize the economy to try to pull us out of the Great Depression. The Supreme Court initially resisted those efforts, but then finally threw in the table between 1937 and about 1944 and, essentially just said, hey, you know what? We're not really going to be in the business. Well, let me not qualify that. We are not going to be in the business at all of requiring that Congress only exercise those powers that were constitutionally delegated to it. And they came up with a number of preposterous and government empowering legal doctrines to essentially rationalize the exercise of congressional power in almost any setting. And I think you're right, James. I mean, I think to the extent implicit in your comment is that we're sort of reaping the bitter fruit of that initial mistake. I think that's exactly right.
Oh, you were on a roll, James. I'm just holding back.
Well, I was hoping Clark would do what he usually does and says, well, that's almost right, James, but you forgot this, this, and this. And he didn't do that. And now I'm left as the optimist in the room. I don't know how we got here, but here we are.
I want to go back to one of you said that we've ended up with two branches of government. That's striking to me. I'd never thought about that, but it sounds exactly right. And in fact, from the little bit I understand about the Roman Empire, that was the prelude to its perhaps protracted fall when the Senate basically became a rubber stamp for whatever the Caesar wanted. And then all of a sudden you went from being a republic to a dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that history is destiny, but I do think that a system that was carefully designed to divide power among three separate branches, and of course also vertically between federal and state governments, it's difficult to see how that continues to work properly if one of the branches refuses to take any meaningful role in governance. And I think that's a fair characterization of what we've seen from Congress over the past, James, you might have a different date than I would, but certainly since the Obama administration. And we're kind of in terra incognita. I don't know how any of this works with a Congress, for example, that refuses to impeach a president who very clearly, in my view, tried to overturn the results of a lawful election. And if President Trump has concluded, as I suspect that he has, that he is now effectively unimpeachable, which I suspect that he is, then, in some sense, all bets are off. And it comes down to essentially a game of chicken between a president who conceives of both his powers and the so-called referendum that he received from the electorate, which he didn't really, but he thinks that he did, playing chicken with a judicial branch that lacks both the power of the purse and the power of the sword. We have not run this simulation before. We've come up to the edge of it before, but we're about to run the simulation and find out just what happens. I think we are.
Let me ask you a question following up on that, Clark. Why do you think he's unimpeachable?
I think that Trump is unimpeachable because there's a lack of integrity among Republicans in the Senate. Many of them simply have their eye on who is going to be the anointed by Trump as the presumptive Republican nominee to run in the next presidential election. I think that's what several Republican senators are clearly there in the Senate to do. They're not all that interested in legislating, and they're not good at it. So they're there essentially as a sort of a long precursor to a run for president. And, when you fail to convict and remove a president from office who has not only tried to overturn the results of a lawful election, but stirred up people to go over to the Capitol and engage in acts of violence to try to disrupt the lawful transfer of power. And you can call that an insurrection or not. I know that that's a controversial term. I don't think we need to get hung up on terminology. Trump was very clearly supporting the people who went over to the Capitol and engaged in violence there. So he pardons all those people, notwithstanding the fact that they did try to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. He was not removed. That's a pretty big green light. And I would say he's committed at least 3 and maybe as many as 8 or 10 impeachable acts since he's been president, just since January 20th, the inauguration. More than any president I think we've ever seen in such a short period of time, with zero response from Congress. I think there are a number of acts that President Trump has taken in the last 100 days that if any other president had taken just one of them, there's a high likelihood that that president would have been impeached and removed. And the fact that we haven't even so much as a raised eyebrow from Republicans in Congress suggests strongly to me that President Trump is now effectively unimpeachable.
Why don't you give us a highlight reel of the 8 or 10 or 12? Give us the top 2 or 3.
So I would say that he is in defiance of the courts. He's kind of playing it cagey. For example, his administration is under orders to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who they admitted should not have been sent to El Salvador, but was anyway. and has been ordered by the courts in a decision that was affirmed by the Supreme Court a couple weeks ago to facilitate the return of that person. At first, there was this sort of game of, I can't do it, maybe the president of El Salvador can. And then he said, well, I don't have the power, it would have to come from America. But recently, President Trump blatantly said, yep, I could get him back, but I'm not going to. So I would say that counts as open defiance of the courts. That should be impeachable. The assault on large law firms, more than a dozen firms received letters or were the subject of executive orders in which, simply because they took positions that the president found uncongenial or employed people who were opposed to Trump in some way, lawyers had their security clearances arbitrarily withheld. Some of those firms, their employees are not allowed to set foot in federal buildings. And there's the executive order in some cases also says that the federal government will no longer do business with companies that are represented by these firms. That is an absolute dagger at the heart of the rule of law. That is a blatant effort to try to discourage lawyers from taking positions that are adverse to the current administration, an administration, by the way, that is engaging in a tremendous amount of legally dubious and in some cases blatantly unlawful behavior, and attempting to cow the entire legal profession into not opposing your administration in court, I think is clearly an impeachable act. I recognize that Harvard, for example, has a lot of red in its ledger, and I'm not going to be one to defend things that happen at Harvard, but threatening to remove nonprofit status of the nation's oldest and perhaps still most prestigious university for essentially refusing to knuckle under when the administration comes along and tells them how to reorder their shop, I think that's impeachable. I could go on, but bottom line, I think the manner in which the administration has flouted the rule of law in many of these deportation cases, singled out not only law firms, but also a couple of individuals in what some people have started calling orders of attainder, and making it clear that a college's ability to continue to have nonprofit status depends on its willingness to accede to demands that the federal government has no legitimate basis to impose. Those are all deeply, deeply concerning assaults on the rule of law, in my view.
I get why even reasonable Republicans would be loath to take action for fear of backlash from their own constituents. But what about the Democrats? Why aren't the Democrats writing up impeachment after impeachment here? I mean, of course, it's not going to go anywhere, but why aren't they in the news pushing back?
Well, that might be a question for James as much as me. The most charitable answer, I think, would be that they may be keeping their powder dry until the midterms to see if they can take back the House, possibly also the Senate, and then actually do something more than just, wave their hand and shriek from the sidelines.
I tend to agree with that because the only competing answer is that they're all cowards and they're terrified of him. And I think there's a fair amount of that, don't get me wrong. But these people are politicians. They're used to shoving back when it suits their needs, and they will do so. I wonder where we're going to be at the midterm election. I don't think there's a way in hell the Republicans are going to hold on to the House in the current situation. But what happens in the Senate will be very, very interesting.
And remember, we're talking about the midterms. We're only 100 days in. The midterms are another, 600 days away?
The midterms started the day after the last election.
James, I can think of one very scary way in which the Republicans could hang on to a majority in the House. And that's if there was an effort to interfere with the midterm elections, and I would not rule that out.
I wouldn't rule it out either, but I think in the end it would backfire so spectacularly that they would think twice, maybe even three times before doing it. I'm not saying that we're going to be immune from that. I don't think we are.
Yeah,
we're in very uncharted territory here.
I think that's right, because two things are true. I think first, it is much more difficult to change the results of an election than most people really appreciate. And second, I think this may actually be the most incompetent administration in the history of the United States. They're just not good at anything, and I suspect they won't be very good at interfering with elections if they were to try.
I'm glad to hear you say that, you think that this might be the most incompetent administration of all time. I am stumbling to that conclusion every time I turn on my television. And I wonder how long they can go without shooting themselves in their collective foot so badly that people are just unwilling to keep putting up with it.
I'm running through my head a comparison between this and Biden and how we went from perhaps the one administration in history that did the least to this one that's now doing all manner of things it's got no business doing.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If the Biden administration had tried to do as many things as the Trump administration or the second Trump administration, it might have proved to be even more incompetent. But whether, intentionally or just a byproduct of President Biden's senescence, they seem to have set their sights much lower and just essentially tried to get across the finish line, which they just barely did. Ultimately, I don't think we need to decide in exactly, like if we put them through a decathlon of incompetence, which one would have scored higher? It's an interesting question. It's a theoretical question. But in terms of actual performance, I've never seen, and I've never even heard of a more incompetent administration than Trump 2.0.
Well, that's just it, right? It's the incompetent administration that we now have versus the incompetent president that we had not too long ago. His administration wasn't nearly as incompetent as he himself was.
Clark, given that Congress is apparently not interested or unable to execute its check on the executive, is there anything the courts can do?
Yes, and they're doing it. So people can continue to bring cases and controversies to the courts. And boy, this administration is sowing a fertile crop of cases and controversies. Forget what the count is. I think it's over 200 cases that have been filed against various administration actions since the inauguration. And the courts churn through those. And, I think by and large doing a pretty good job, especially given the very compressed time frame that many of these cases are on. Courts generally don't do their best work on a tight time frame, but they're doing their best. My colleague, Wally Olson, just published a piece in the Dispatch about this that I really commend, and maybe we can put it in the show notes, about the contempt power of the courts, because that's the last chip that courts have to play. If the executive branch chooses to defy a court order, and that has happened before, not a Supreme Court order, they've come close, but in my view, we haven't actually seen open defiance of a Supreme Court order. But if an executive branch official refuses to comply with a court order, the courts do have the power to hold that person in contempt or even that agency in contempt. And there are two kinds of contempt. There's civil contempt, sometimes known as coercive contempt, which is where you either impose fines or actually lock people up until they comply. And once they comply, they have to be released or the fines have to be terminated. That's civil contempt, aka coercive contempt. You're trying to apply pressure to induce the executive branch official to take a particular action, which is to say comply with a court order. But then there's criminal contempt, when the open defiance of the court order or doing something in the presence of a court, such as telling a blatant lie, so offends, sort of the integrity of the judicial process that the person is then held, or the agency is then held in criminal contempt for the thing they did. And then some punishment is imposed, usually in the form of a fine, but it can also be incarceration. It is a really scary question. What would happen in the current environment if a court were to hold a member of the Trump administration, perhaps even President Trump himself, in contempt? Because what is the enforcement mechanism? Some people would say, oh, well, then you just have the Marshal Service go impose whatever the court order is. Well, guess what? The Marshal Service doesn't work for the courts. They work for the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice works for the president. So we're really in, again, I hate to overuse the word, but we're in terra incognita. This is a blank slate. We've never been here. We don't really know what would happen if a court imposed a contempt order and then the executive branch said, well, that's your opinion. We're not going to enforce that order. That would be a real constitutional crisis, I would say.
And one would hope that members of the, what did you say, the judicial... Not the judicial branch. The marshals work for whom?
Oh, so the Marshal Service provides security for federal courthouses and judges, but they don't actually work for the judiciary. They don't work for Article 3. They work
the Justice Department. Yeah.
For the Justice Department. Yeah, that's right.
So one would hope that members of the Justice Department would take their oath to the Constitution seriously and say, look, I owe my allegiance more to the Constitution than I do to the person sitting in the Oval Office. Therefore, I'm going to send the marshals per the court's decision. Now, that's not going to happen, and people are going to point to Republicans there, but I'm going to point back to the Democrats when they should have been invoking the 25th Amendment, when Biden was clearly not mentally competent. And yet there we got the same thing of loyalty to the person being held higher than their constitutional oath.
Let me remind you of what happened. I think it was last week. It might have been the week before, when some crackpot member of the press asked the president if he had to uphold the Constitution, and he claimed not to know.
I quipped on Twitter that we get so used to President Trump lying that it's kind of a shock when he finally tells the truth, but I think he's probably telling the truth there. I think he probably thinks there's some question as to the nature of that oath. I'm not even sure if he remembers taking one.
Yeah, you'd think he might have read it. You'd think he might have familiarized himself with it. But at this point, he gave the answer I kind of expected, right? He's at that point where he literally thinks he can do anything as president and no one can stand in his way. And that is the exact opposite conclusion one should draw in a functioning constitutional republic. But we don't have a functioning constitutional republic anymore.
Ooh, that's
Yeah, and I think that's the key. We have said, probably all three of us at one point or another, that a system that depends on the integrity of the individual is a poor system. And so we have the checks and balances. So in some sense, he's acting the way that the founders, I would have to say, expected. He's running rampant with as much power as he can. The problem is the checks and balances aren't working.
I would maybe amend that, Anne. I wouldn't necessarily say expected. I might say either feared or anticipated would be possible.
Sure.
And that's why they built in so many guardrails. I think what they couldn't have foreseen, and here I'm going to name who I think are the real villains in this whole mess, perhaps besides President Trump. I know some people feel like, well, Biden was just as bad and, Trump's really not that much worse. I don't want to have that argument. I want to name the real indisputable villains in this, and that is the worthless hacks among the Republican senators who refuse to stand up to Trump and tell him, look, we'll have your back as long as you're plausibly within what the Constitution permits and you're showing respect for the rule of law, including the courts and the correct process for challenging a court decision you disagree with, which is to appeal it up the system and play by the rules. That's not happening. And this pack of quislings, of spineless, worthless hacks in the Senate who should have impeached and removed the president already and should be at least making noises about doing so again, I think are the true villains in this drama. And as you can tell, I'm pretty worked up about it because I tend to agree with James. It's not at all clear that we still have a functioning constitutional republic. And if you had to point to one group of people who bear more responsibility for that than anybody else, you look to those spineless Republican senators.
And there's an interesting thing here, Clark, right? I, of all people, am loath to criticize the founders and the framers. I think they did a wonderful job with what they had. But if you go back and you really plow through what was going on in 1787, you get this idea, and it really comes to the fore in Federalist number 48, where they claim that there's this impetuous vortex of power, and Congress just gobbles up power everywhere we look. Let me just read it out loud because it's really telling. It is against the enterprising ambition of this department that the people ought to indulge all their jealousy and exhaust all their precaution. And I think the framers set up a government which stymied the legislative branch just a little too much.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to agree with that, but maybe we don't need to go too far down that rabbit trail. I think what I would say is if the founders had designed a system in such a way that it would be capable of averting the crisis we have now, which I see as a Congress that is insufficiently protective of its own powers and prerogatives and insufficiently protective of constitutionally limited government and the rule of law and separation of powers, the collision of that body and a fundamentally authoritarian president who is as vindictive, I think, and contemptuous of the system, given the way that he's been treated. And let's be clear, President Trump was treated badly. And if he perceives himself to have been the victim of some lawless attacks, I would agree with him in his first administration. So he's not entirely wrong if he's in a vindictive frame of mind. But the way he's going about it is deeply problematic. And I would say if the framers had tried to design a system that could survive or overcome the collision of a feckless Congress and an authoritarian president, we might not have even made it to this point, because that Constitution would look a lot different than the one we have. And they had to try to find kind of an equilibrium, which I think they did. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Constitution has lasted longer than any other major constitution in the world. We might get through this. I began the conversation by saying I think, we're close to even money for me about whether we get through this without some substantial rip or tear in the fabric of civil society and constitutional government that doesn't fully repair. I still think we'll be ostensibly a functioning democracy in 8 or 10 years, but we might be one whose fabric has been so badly torn that the cake is baked and it's just a question of how long we limp along.
Is it that, Clark, or is it that the voters, the Congress wakes up and realizes, okay, we've got to do things differently. This has to not happen again?
Are you saying could that still happen?
Yeah.
I think it could still happen, but maybe I'm overworking the metaphor of the torn fabric. But I think that our system depends to a greater extent than maybe we realized. Unspoken norms, respecting things like the filibuster, even though that's not in the Constitution, and obeying court orders that you disagree with, even though the court has no power to enforce them. These are norms. There's no enforcement mechanism for any of this. And I guess my point is that if those norms are sufficiently stressed, some of them will tear, and I'm not sure they repair real well. And I would say the one I'm the most concerned about would be open defiance of an order from the U.S. Supreme Court, or more accurately, a decision of the Supreme Court affirming the enforceability of a lower court order. And I would say open defiance of that might be a breach of norms that we never entirely recover from. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm just saying that would be one that I would not be surprised to find out we never came back from that if it were to happen.
Why do you think the American people have been so willing to abandon the tradition of limited government? That's really what it comes down to, right? They're willing to elect people who say, well, I don't care what we've done before, we're going to do it my way now. And people line up behind it and say, well, okay, let's do that.
Yeah, James, that's such a great question. I don't know if I know the answer to that, but I'll get the ball rolling. Maybe we can all sort of chip in. I do think that when Congress started exercising powers that were clearly forbidden. I mean, think about enumerated powers. The founders decided that not only did they have to say that Congress had the power to create post offices, they said, and also post roads.
Post roads.
Post roads.
Yeah. Post roads.
Right? That's awfully detailed if you also meant, and also, of course, nationalize healthcare and make people buy government-approved health insurance. Well, of course that. I mean, we didn't think to put that in there. And a $30 billion federal Department of Education? Sure, of course, that comes along too, even though we didn't mention it. So you get this really granular level of detail with things like post roads, right? But then there are some people who seriously take the position that, of course they meant the federal role in education and, healthcare and a universal retirement system that's also not mentioned in the text. I think that once the Supreme Court decides that it has to rationalize the existence of those programs and legitimize the naked usurpation of power by Congress that is manifest in those programs, maybe there's no coming back from that, right? Because now you've got this kind of homogeneous polity. You can get a little bit of difference if you move from California to Texas, but you're supposed to be able to get a lot of difference when you move from California to Texas or New Jersey to Florida, whatever it might be. And so in effect, they took a whole bunch of people with radically different values and ideas about what government should and shouldn't do. And instead of letting them disperse to the different parts of the country where they feel most comfortable and kind of leave each other alone, they effectively cooped us all up in one cage and put us at each other's throats. There's no way to get away from somebody who thinks that we ought to tax the billionaires into the poorhouse. You can't get away from that person anymore. But if we had a system of federalism and localized government that the framers envisioned and baked into the Constitution, all those billionaires could go down and set up shop down there with Elon Musk outside of Austin, Texas, and not get taxed at a whatever marginal rate of 36 or even 95%, which it was at one time, and be safe. But man, there's nowhere to run now.
That is about the best way I've ever heard that argument put. That was superb.
It was superb, but it's also very sad.
Yeah.
Right? We take that thing that made us what we were, and we just threw it out the window.
Yeah, and what the framers appreciated that I think we didn't sufficiently appreciate is the inevitability of what our philosopher friends would call incommensurable values, right? So one person might put a lot of value on equality or the distribution of resources and wanting to make sure that there's never an excessive, whatever that means, income gap, because they fundamentally feel that everybody should have a minimally decent life. And then other people might say, well, that's important, but what's even more important is ensuring that people are able to enjoy the fruits of their own labors and their smart risk-taking and their willingness to invest and their productivity. And in some sense, neither of those two people is wrong exactly, but it may be that they just need to be able to live apart in places that prioritize those values differently. And so, again, like California is kind of an equality of outcome state, whereas Texas might be an equality of opportunity state. And some people prefer one environment, some people prefer the other environment. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but if we had a properly operating system of federalism, your life in California would look radically different than your life in Texas. And now it only looks moderately different. So I think that's really the problem. And what happens is we become contemptuous of each other. When I say each other, I mean Americans have kind of roughly divided into two different camps, one of which is a fundamentally, I would say, social justice camp, that the most important thing that government can do is ensure equality of outcomes. And then the other camp is more of a, sort of entrepreneurial and free market camp that essentially, as long as everybody starts in roughly the same place, we let the chips fall where they may. And if some people end up billionaires like Steve Jobs and other people end up unemployed, then that's just the way it is. Perhaps we all kick in a little something so that we don't have to watch our fellow citizens starve or step over anybody who can't get enough medical care just because they don't have any money. But that's it. Social safety net and no more. And I think our ability to kind of, I hate to use the word, but self-segregate into communities that are more consistent with our values is why we're so angry at each other right now. And I do think we're angry at each other. I think we are as polarized as we have ever been since the Civil War. And, sort of each side feels so aggrieved that there's nothing that its leaders can't do to the other side that they would feel like is unwarranted and unfair, and we shouldn't do that. Think about all the whataboutism that you encounter, because I'm sure you encounter as much as I do. You say anything bad about what Trump's doing, and you've probably got friends who the first thing they will say is, well, wait a minute. Let me tell you what the Biden administration did, or let me tell you what Obama did. And of course, the response to that is, yeah, that was bad too. We should be upset about all of it.
But very few of us can actually see through our partisan differences. Like, when I think about Barack Obama, the very first thing that comes to mind is that he used drones to kill American citizens. Now, if we're going to let that slide, then how on earth are we going to scale back deportations, which stop way short of drone strikes against your own people?
Yeah, and James, it's even worse than that. We're not just letting it slide, right? We've got people who would have to first know who authorized that drone strike to know whether they should be outraged by it or supportive of it, right? Oh, who was it? Was it Bush? Oh, well, he's a war criminal. That's exactly what I'd expect from that guy. Then you're like, no, just kidding. It was Obama. Oh, well, tell me more. Were these really bad guys? And I'm sure Obama knew what he was doing. Yeah, so you get the point. That's a really scary place to be, right? Where the exact same action is either outrageous and intolerable, or just the way sometimes, great powers have to be wielded. And the only way you can know which one it was is you have to know which president was the one who gave the order.
Yeah, and I would have pushed back very strenuously on your assertion that this is the most divided we've been since the Civil War until very recent days. Because, we've got 1968 in our history, and we could point to it where, political violence was pronounced. There was a fair amount of political violence, and we haven't really had any yet here, but it's coming. I don't think there's a way in how we avoid it at this point.
Yeah, I don't know if it's true or not, but maybe you guys have heard the same thing, but supposedly marriage counselors will tell you that a marriage can survive almost anything except contempt, and that when one or both spouses feel contempt for each other, it's over. And I think, to me, that's kind of where I see us turning the corner, because I do think that a significant number of Americans are fundamentally contemptuous of a significant number of other Americans. And that goes both ways. I don't see very much good faith anymore. I don't see charity anymore. I think there's just mostly, sort of a visceral disgust. The woke is disgusted with MAGA, and MAGA's disgusted with woke, and those of us in the middle are kind of disgusted with both of them. And if that kind of contempt has set in, I wonder if there's sort of an analogy to this, what ultimately can destroy a marriage is, this contempt where you just think, I don't even want to patch it up. You know what? I'm done.
It's interesting you say this, because I had this exact experience just this past week. I got onto a discussion on my sister's feed on Facebook, and she had said something about the election. And I made the point that, along the lines that you're making, the left and the right extremes make us look like we're at each other's throats. We got a bunch of people in the middle who are relatively reasonable that we're not hearing from and are being pulled by these extremes. And there were several people on this feed who, for whatever reason, thought I was a Trump supporter. And immediately they're laying into me and assuming all kinds of things behind what I said and denigrating and word name calling the whole thing. And this goes on and on for a bit until my sister steps in and says, he didn't vote for Trump. And all of a sudden, I didn't say a word. And all of a sudden, people are apologizing and rereading stuff that I wrote. But it's this thing that we tend to all do. I think social media just makes it worse. You assume what's in the other person's heart and mind simply on the basis of who you think they voted for.
Yeah, that's dismaying. But you know what? I mean, let's sort of take the devil's advocate here, right? I don't mean to legitimize, sort of retconning or whataboutism, but was anybody else rather appalled when the Democrats came to the conclusion that Joe Biden was not fit to run for president, but he was still fit to be president? That's, I would say, rather concerning. And I would say it was rather clear to all of us that at least by the time of that debate, in I think it was June of 2024, that this man was really not fit to be the commander-in-chief of the world's leading superpower. And to the extent I kind of feel that it was both irresponsible and maybe even unforgivable that you guys left this person in office and left our country as vulnerable as it was, and self-evidently turned over the job of being president to some, unnamed group of people who were very clearly calling the shots at some point. To the extent people are still angry about that and deeply resentful about it, I'm not going to tell them they're wrong. But I'm also going to say that if you're not outraged by at least some of the things that President Trump has been doing in his second administration, I'm not going to let you off the hook either. You ought to be outraged. You ought to be as outraged at some of the things that President Trump has done in the past couple of months as you were about the fact that they left a fundamentally senile and incompetent president who wasn't capable of discharging the powers of the office in that office. We were let down in both cases. So it's kind of funny, right? Everybody's right and everybody's mad, and again, I come back to, I kind of get this feeling almost that people are sort of yeah, I'm done. I don't even want to patch it up with these people. I don't want to be in the same country with them. I'm not advocating for that, by the way. I think that would be a real tragedy. But it's getting harder and harder to say to somebody who's really disgusted with, those guys on the other side, that they are wrong. I feel like I'm down to my last card, which is, yeah, you know what? You're right to be disgusted, but, we all have a civic duty to extend as much charity as we can to our fellow citizens, if nothing else than for the sake of trying to hold this incredible American experiment together and not let it die, because there's never been, I think, a more powerful expression of everything that is, right about good governance, about protecting liberty, about putting citizens and autonomy first. I think we cracked that code. We've had a good run. Boy, I'd hate in retrospect to find out that we let it go on our watch.
The interesting thing here is that somebody has to step up, and by somebody I mean some group of people, some meaningful number of people, have to stand up and say, we're better than that. We're not playing this game anymore. We have to be better than that. And I think that the odds of that happening are slim and none, given the present context. And I think in the end, where we started with this, where you started, Clark, you started by saying it's an impeachable offense, that Donald Trump is ignoring court orders. Sooner or later, the Supreme Court will dig in its heels and say, you will do this right now. And he will look at them, and he's going to have a big choice to make that day. And I don't think he has the character to say, okay, that's what the system requires, that's what I'll do. If we don't have people at crucial times who are willing to do those sorts of things, the experiment is lost.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it is inevitable that Trump would defy a Supreme Court decision, but if he chooses not to, it won't be because of anything having to do with character or patriotism or any sort of understanding of the importance of the rule of law and how it's more important than any one person or one administration. It'll be from some sort of naked political calculus about either, how his interests are best served or his progeny. If he thinks it undermines the chances of installing Donald Trump Jr. as the next president, and I don't know if that's on his mind, but if it is, I would say that would be the reason why he would choose not to defy a Supreme Court order, but it ain't going to be because of anything to do with character or commitment to the Constitution.
God, I wish there was a different answer.
I mean, should I try to tell a funny joke, or we're just going to let it end horrible?
Yeah. Well, Clark, I don't think thank you is the correct thing to say right now, but thank you.
Well, Ant, I just want to share one thing with you in particular, and also James, I guess, because, you mentioned that nobody's out there trying to do this. I don't know if you guys remember, but I'm on the board of directors of a nonprofit called the One America Movement that was created 8 years ago to actually to fight back against toxic polarity in society. 8 years ago. And we had a summit Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday morning in Tulsa, and it was for faith leaders, because it's a fundamentally sort of faith-oriented organization, which is kind of funny. So I'm sort of their token libertarian atheist, but they keep me around anyway. And I will say, the explicit mission of that organization is to bring people together from across the spectrum, religious, ideological, et cetera. And so I'm not suggesting that it will be enough, but it was really moving to be in the presence of a couple hundred people who are doing their level best to set aside the animus, the mutual recriminations, and just say, this country is more important than any feeling of resentment or betrayal. Will it be enough? I don't know. But I'm here to tell you that there are some really great people of good faith who are trying their level best. Put it this way, if a libertarian atheist can go hang out with a bunch of rabbis and imams and pastors and priests for 2 days and come back feeling better than when he went down there, they're onto something, I think.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.